Hi, everybody. I'm Shula Newman. I'm the executive editor at St. Louis Public Radio, and I'm really glad that you are joining us for the second annual Justice Speaks event. We're pleased to be partnering with Legal Services of Eastern Missouri once again for this event. Justice Speaks is designed to bring the community together to shine a spotlight on the topic of access to justice and to encourage dialogue about the way to achieve justice and equity for all. For nearly 65 years, Legal Services of Eastern Missouri has been providing free legal representation, community education, and supportive services for disadvantaged clients and families in 21 Eastern Missouri counties. By partnering with other community providers, Legal Services improves lives, promotes fairness, and creates opportunities for those in need. We want to thank our sponsors for this event. That's Missouri Lawyers Media and the Brian Cave Leighton Paisner Law Firm. We also want to thank the members of St. Louis Public Radio. Our more than 25,000 donors, many of you are among them, contributed nearly $5.5 million last year, allowing us to bring you award-winning local news, podcasts, and events like this. We are delighted to welcome NPR Washington Desk Justice Correspondent Carrie Johnson. She covers a wide variety of stories about justice issues, law enforcement, and legal affairs for NPR. Among her many accomplishments, Carrie has chronicled major challenges to the landmark voting rights law, a botched law enforcement operation targeting gun traffickers along the southwest border, and the Obama administration's deadly drone program for suspected terrorists overseas. That's just to name a few. Prior to joining NPR in 2010, Carrie worked for the Washington Post for 10 years, and earlier in her career, she wrote about courts for the weekly publication Legal Times. Her work has been honored with awards from the Robert F. Kennedy Justice Center for the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights and the Society of Professional Journalists. And she's also been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Breaking News for team coverage of the massacre at Fort Hood, Texas. Carrie's a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and Benedictine University in Illinois, a Midwesterner. Hosting our conversation with Carrie tonight is St. Louis Public Radio's own justice correspondent, Rachel Lippmann. Rachel covers courts, public safety, and city politics. St. Louis is Rachel's hometown, and she joined our station in 2008 after spending 2 years in Lansing, Michigan, covering the Michigan Capitol and various other state political shenanigans for the NPR affiliates there. Rachel has an undergraduate degree from the Medill School of Journalism and a master's in public affairs reporting from the University of Illinois at Springfield. So, a bit of housekeeping. We're going to save some time for questions and answers later in the program. You do not need to have a Twitch account for this event. However, you should create an account in order to post questions via the chat function on Twitch. And with that little bit of housekeeping, I'm going to turn this whole event over to Rachel and to Carrie.
Shula, thank you. Carrie, it is an honor to be able to do this. I wish we could be face-to-face on a stage in front of all of our wonderful sponsors and guests and listeners, but we need to be safe about this. The topic of tonight is the issue of the justice gap. And what was your first exposure as you were covering some of these issues to this idea of a justice gap? As I understand it, it was actually pretty early on in your illustrious reporting career.
Yeah, Rachel, I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much, and to be in conversation with you. I must say that I moved to Washington more than 20 years ago now, and as a very young reporter, one of my first big stories was a series on the landlord-tenant court here in Washington, and I spent a lot of time in the courthouse observing people in the waiting room of that court. And it was among the saddest things I've covered, I gotta say, in all of these years, because there were so many people there who desperately needed legal help so they could preserve their homes, so they would have a place to shelter. And there were really no lawyers that I saw except lawyers for the landlords. And so I had, at the time, I think I was 22 years old. And I had people coming up to me asking me if I were a lawyer and if I might be able to help them. And as part of that series, I did some watch-alongs with U.S. Marshals who were doing evictions. And I've never forgotten how terribly sad that was. And now sometimes at the end of a month, I'll walk home and I'll see people's possessions strewn on the ground, and I'll know it's not somebody who's moving. This was an eviction. And it really drove home for me the notion that there are so many lawyers in Washington and all over the country, but there's still so many people in desperate need of legal help.
And is there a moment that kind of stuck out to you where you realized how just out of whack the system was in terms of these lawyers representing landlords and how much of a disadvantage it put these tenants at to not have an attorney?
Yeah, very few, if any, of the tenants were represented by legal counsel, and you could tell in the results. Here in DC, we generally have very strong pro-tenant laws, and still, without legal services, when you're in that courtroom, you wind up in a world of hurt. And that was many, many years ago. We are right now in the middle of such a tragic economic downturn. And there's been an eviction moratorium, but that's going to expire relatively soon. And I shudder to think of the people, the moms and dads and kids and elderly people and the people who are vulnerable who could soon be out on the street.
And in those tenant landlord situations, you said DC generally has pretty strong tenant laws. How would an attorney have helped some of these clients, or even just, somebody explaining them, holding their hand, have helped them stay in their homes? Like, what were they just not aware of what the laws were? Or how was that happening?
That's it, right? So if you are living on the margins and having a hard time making it day to day, sometimes you have mental health issues or other problems that are preventing you from looking up what the state of the law is, or making a phone call to the regulatory agency in town and finding out what that is. If you can get somebody to return your phone call, if you have phone service and can afford to pay your phone bill. These are just spiraling situations for people, I think. And, for people who work low wage hourly jobs, you really can't take time off to show up in court, especially if you have to sit around waiting all day. And also, what are you going to do about childcare? If you don't have childcare, you're going to bring your kids to the court and sit around all day. These are real challenges. And as you know, if you are charged with a serious crime, you have a right to an attorney. But that is not the case in some of these matters of near life and death when it comes to housing, child custody, benefits, including health insurance and food stamp type benefits. These are very serious problems that people face.
So our audience may not know, Carrie and I, quote unquote, met in Ferguson. We have not actually ever met face to face, but our first interactions were as the Justice Department was coming in to investigate the city of Ferguson and its police department. And I'm sure most of you are aware of the findings of that report, excessive fines and fees, that all the general stuff. How did what you saw in that report from Ferguson highlight sort of the justice gap as it exists beyond even just housing court?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the notion that if you have too many tickets, you lose your driver's license. And that can mean not just not being able to drive your kids to school or daycare. It can mean not being able to get to work. So you're further and further behind. All of these things where you wind up incarcerated or in jail for a period of time, and you might lose custody of your kids if you're a single parent, all for, tickets that you couldn't afford to pay, or kind of low-level fines that should not cost you your job, your child custody, your driving privileges. And, certainly that Ferguson report hit like a thunderbolt, I think, not just in St. Louis and Missouri, but around the country. And it really prompted a remarkable amount of attention and pro bono work, and to some extent, municipal and legislative work. But all these years later, a lot of lawyers and a lot of people are still fighting that fight, even though it seemed it seemed both shocking and in need of fixing. These problems are difficult to fix.
As you were looking at that report, did anything kind of cross your mind about just how this could have been fixed with a broader access to having attorneys there to, tell people what they might be risking if they take this course of action?
Yeah, certainly legal advice, and really at the policy level, Rachel, this whole idea that certain municipal agencies were funding their operations on the backs of poor people of color. I mean, is that what one would want to do for one's constituents? What kind of cost is there to community trust, as we saw so tragically, so poignantly, trust that is still being rebuilt today. I mean, we are still in the midst of kind of an international series of marches over police conduct and how governments treat people they are supposed to serve. And I think we're still having that conversation. And one of the things that's been so remarkable about this year, that's been so awful for so many millions of people, is, people who may have started to pay attention to some of these issues in Ferguson are realizing that a whole bunch of other people, millions of people in the US and around the country, didn't really get it. And they started to get it sometime this summer.
Are there broader access to justice issues do you see within some of these marches that have been going on? Where do you potentially see it popping up in some of these racial equity issues that have come to the forefront in June and with the pandemic and the way that it has struck communities of color harder than white communities?
Well, on the criminal side, just the idea, even without anybody being charged, the whole issue of traffic stops and disproportionate traffic or street stops of people in certain neighborhoods where policing doesn't happen as aggressively in other neighborhoods. So you have like what some of these experts call over-policing in certain neighborhoods, and yet under-policing in the same neighborhood where you have, 9 or 10 or 20% of homicides and shootings being solved by police in those neighborhoods. And meanwhile, the same law enforcement officers are routinely pulling over kids of color based on very little suspicion. And so that's deeply problematic and happening in a lot of places all over the country still. With respect to the civil side of the justice gap, I think one story that's been a little bit undercovered in the pandemic is what happens to children and parents' access to children in these kinds of COVID-19 preventative conditions. So if you want to see your kid and your kid is in foster care, that can be very difficult right now. If you are part of a family that is divided in some fashion, the mom and dad are divorced or never married and are split up, how do you guarantee that both parents have access to child visitation at these times and that their conditions are safe? And there are not enough legal advisors to help people in these situations. You can go, I think in some cases, months without seeing your kids. I can't imagine at a time when family is more important than ever this year, the notion that there aren't enough advisors to help people with family custody and family visitation privileges is a real thing.
Do you have a sense of how large that problem is or how much worse it's gotten in the pandemic in terms of, you always hear about custody disputes, mom won't follow the parenting plan, dad doesn't give the kids up. But I mean, is that something that you have been able to kind of cover and dive into, or?
No, I'm just starting to think about it now, and I haven't quantified the issue. There has been some attempt, Rachel, to quantify what's happening in terms of domestic violence in homes, but that's even hard because people who are suffering that kind of abuse can't get away to make phone calls or texts in the pandemic or have no other place to go. But there's been less of an effort so far, I think, to quantify some of the family custody and visitation issues. I'm starting to think about trying to do that in January.
Sticking a little bit with the pandemic, and this may be a bit of a curveball question for you, but I know St. Louis County, the city of St. Louis, many of the courts in Missouri just have not really opened their doors much to criminal trials. It just isn't safe to have all of the people you need to do a trial in there. What do you think? Are there going to be sort of broader Sixth Amendment, speedy trial, access to justice concerns, and trying to balance safety with these individuals' right to have their day in court?
Yeah, I think there's an enormous issue here. There's an enormous constitutional issue here, potentially. I mean, you have people who are incarcerated, and we know that that jails and prisons are the sources of some of the biggest COVID outbreaks and super spreader events in the country, not necessarily because the people who are incarcerated are spreading, but that the people who work in the facility are going in and out and infecting folks. And so these are people who have not been accused, who have not rather been convicted of any wrongdoing, and are waiting for their day in court, which is not coming. And to the extent that they have hearings or visitation, it's like on Zoom or a phone call. But for some other stories I'm doing that are in the works now, I can tell you that I've been talking with prisoners. They get, in some systems, 1 or 2 15-minute phone calls a day max. And waiting in line for those calls is a source of great concern to them. They do not want to be exposed. The healthcare in prison in the best of times is inadequate. And right now it is super scary. So I worry a lot about those people. And there's starting to be a conversation now about vaccine prioritization. I think we're starting to see some of that in the last few days. And certainly, corrections officers are making a case that they should be higher up in line in terms of vaccine prioritization. But we're starting to see people of really deep intellect, like Danielle Allen at Harvard, talking about how, people who are incarcerated are in the custody of the government, and what happens to them there is in our name. And so they're trying to make a case to make sure that people behind bars get access to the vaccine as well early.
On the civil side, which is where legal aid provides the assistance, what are some of the access to justice concerns that are coming up here for maybe issues that legal aid would deal with? Not a big corporate lawsuit that's being delayed, but, landlord tenant, sewer bill issues, utility turnoffs, etc. All of those kind of civil court issues where legal aid would be helping. What are some of the concerns you're hearing about starting to percolate there with the courtrooms in some fashion closed?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, in the best of times, civil disputes take a backseat to all these criminal matters, right? And in the old days, you'd be waiting forever to get your Social Security benefits case heard, or a custody battle, or the like. And now, I mean, given where many courts are, this is a very serious problem, I think. And, these people who who are in court or need to be in court, their problems don't go away, they exacerbate. And so the idea that they're waiting for months or potentially years is very problematic. And imagine this, Rachel, you are in a pandemic, you've lost your job, you wind up moving to a place that costs less money, or to, a motel or a hotel, and whatever legal notices that were getting mailed to you at your prior address may not be coming to you at your new address. You may not even get notice. And so these people need a lot of help, and it's worrisome that they're not necessarily getting it.
I found a 2012 article that you'd written on the legal aid funding crisis back at that time. Has the situation for the legal service system improved at all since that point?
I was reading the other day that the funding in the 1980s for legal services was about in line with what it's been recently, even though the need has gone up dramatically. And, Congress has a hard time getting most things done these days. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We all know that's true. I think we've narrowly avoided tonight a government shutdown, which was going to happen, at least for a week. We've avoided that.
How very 2020.
Yeah, right. But I think that demand has gone up so high, especially when it comes to evictions. And a likely coming wave of evictions, that legal services has asked Congress for access to tens of millions of more dollars, and I'm not so sure they're going to get them. Clearly, the Trump administration, not a political statement, just a fact, has tried to zero out funding for legal services repeatedly. That has not succeeded because there's bipartisan support for some funding for legal services, but it's never enough to meet demand. And since demand is soaring now and going to get even stronger in January, I think in February, this is a real thing to watch on Capitol Hill.
Legal Aid has played, the Legal Services of Eastern Missouri, in partnership with pro bono work, has played a big role here in St. Louis with getting unhoused children into school in the Riverview Gardens area, and also saving public housing infrastructure in Wellston. What gets lost when these groups aren't as strongly funded as they need to be?
Well, I think we've all seen, with the exception of people who can afford to hire private tutors for their kids, I think we've all seen the cost to kids and their parents when they're not in school, and the notion that homeless kids who may be getting 2 or sometimes 3 meals a day because they are connected to a school system are not getting those services because it was too difficult to enroll them. The school was wary, whatever arguments the school districts were making. That case in particular that was handled by legal services in your neck of the woods, I thought was really important, especially now. We have food lines in many, many places around the country, and I'm afraid we're going to see even more of that in January and February. And the notion that that kids are going hungry when they could have access to some help through schools. I mean, those kinds of cases make a difference, not just in Missouri, but all over the country.
So I'm going to ask what will probably be a very provocative question, given who our sponsors and our audience are. But, the stats from the St. Louis area that there are 10 volunteer lawyers for every 10,000 people. And does the legal system need to be as complicated as it is? Should you need a lawyer to deal with the legal system? Or should some of these people not need to have jobs anymore?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, Rachel, but I would argue that the system doesn't need to be so complicated. And happily, with the notion that most people have phones now, and the fact that you can fill out forms that way, represents an opportunity, right? There's an opportunity for education and an opportunity to get a lot of things done so you don't necessarily have to take a day off work unpaid to go to court. And I think some of those services, some of the software programs and the like have helped, but there's not enough awareness of them. And we need to have lawyers who help at the end, right? So I'm just going to tell you a story from my own life. A few years ago, I realized, everybody probably should have a will. You're healthy or young enough, whatever, you should probably have a will. And I thought, I live in Washington. I've covered lawyers for 23 years or something like that. Can I just call somebody up and make an appointment to do my will? But I wasn't important. My estate, as it were, wasn't worth it enough for any lawyer I knew to take my matter. So one of my sources advised me to just go on LegalZoom and pay whatever, $200 a year and do my will by filling out a form. And wouldn't it be nice if other people could have access to those kinds of services at an even lower cost? And maybe at the end, it would require an hour of a lawyer's time to help them for free, for pro bono, or they could take their taxes, their tax return to legal services or somewhere else, and somebody could just review. Some big firm partner who handles tax issues could take an hour of his or her time and just make sure there were no mistakes there. there certainly are more opportunities to do that and take advantage of those kinds of services, I think.
Where are some of the touch points where you see mobile technology, virtual technology, et cetera, potentially demystifying legal services or, equalizing access to them?
Well, certainly, I think we've seen over the years, sometimes TV shows can help the education process, right? I mean, there are goofy shows in the middle of the day. I watch them if I'm homesick. That can give you a flavor for what it's like to appear in court. And even though they're a little melodramatic, you do get a sense of the kinds of issues and the kinds of documents you need to bring to court to prove your case. It should be easier. It should be easier to advise people beforehand what kinds of materials they need to bring and how they can get those materials, right? So if you've paid your rent and your landlord is moving to evict you, and you have some receipts, or you don't know how to get the receipts, but they're available somehow, there should be some advice for folks so they don't show up bewildered and weeping, as I saw in my 20s, and I just couldn't help those people. And they haunt me to this day.
As a reminder, if you have questions for Carrie Johnson, you can put them into the chat box in Twitch, and we will get to them in a bit. Carrie, obviously, your client, Nina Totenberg, has had a busy year with transition on the Supreme Court and some big issues there. And I'm wondering, as you look at the new makeup of the Supreme Court, are you seeing any tea leaves that are telling you about whether access to justice issues may become more prominent as they get there, or how the Supreme Court may look at and judge these issues, or?
Well, I think it's a little too early to say with the Trump justices. What I will say is that I expect some big changes moving forward in the new Justice Department, in the Biden-Harris Justice Department. And the reason I expect that is that there are think tanks in Washington already pushing the new Justice Department to reinstitute what's called an Access to Justice Office. I think a lot of people know this probably already in the audience, but about 10 years ago, President Obama's Justice Department created an Access to Justice Office. And the first guy who was put in charge of it is Larry Tribe, very famous Harvard professor, and wrote a remarkable textbook on constitutional law. And that was a mark of how seriously the Obama DOJ took access to justice issues. What kinds of things did they do? They played a big convening role, right? So the federal government doesn't have a major role in local systems, obviously, but they can provide funding, they can provide education, they can provide communications and messaging. They did a bunch of activities with respect to right to counsel issues for juveniles and adults accused of serious crimes. And the Center for American Progress has already been pushing the new Biden team to reinstitute that Access to Justice Office and get that underway relatively early, especially because there's going to be so much demand for these services, as we've discussed.
And what are some of the other ways that any presidential administration, be it Biden, Harris, be whoever it may follow, can play in pushing access to justice either one way or the other? How might a more activist administration, for example, move on these issues, even if they can't directly fund it, for example?
Yeah, well, I expect, the thing about justice issues, as you know, is that they cross all of these boundaries. That's why it's so hard to fix anything, because each state, each municipality has its own system, and the federal government kind of helps with funding and convening and bully pulping. But the notion that justice means not just who appears in court or who gets charged with a crime or the whole law and order business we've been hearing so much about, but rather education, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HHS, all of these departments that are undergoing a transition now will have a role to play depending on the issues. So I know already I've been reading a little bit about education policy moving forward, and this idea of the school to prison pipeline that we've heard about, you know, the notion that kids of color get disproportionate punishment than white kids, even though they don't misbehave more often. The Trump administration revoked some guidance from the Justice Department and the Education Department in that space. And I think the new Biden DOJ will get back into that set of issues moving forward.
Are there ways that an administration or a Congress or any of the DC apparatus could take on the bully pulpit role of just simply the cost of becoming a lawyer? How much of this issue of, you know, legal services is understaffed, is part of people, you know, there's not enough money to pay back those bills? What do you think could be done on that end to sort of improve access to justice?
You know, there are remarkable organizations out there, including some big law firms that fund pro bono efforts and that fund fellowships at places like Equal Justice Works and other places that where lawyers are doing real access to justice projects, fines and fees, places like the Civil Rights Corps that were so active in Missouri and are active still in Houston and Maryland and a lot of other places. It is true that people who go to certain kinds of law schools have tremendous amount of legal debt. And they then feel in order to resolve that legal debt, they need to take a job at a big law firm and make a lot of money. And then they get trapped in that cycle, right? But there are increasingly programs, and there have been programs where you do have some debt forgiveness, I think, if you go into a nonprofit job for a period of years. And those programs make a lot of sense to me. I spent 10 months in the last year and earlier this year doing a fellowship in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I know that some of those issues are front of mind at Harvard Law School and a number of other law schools around the country. The idea is that some of the most important work that needs to be done in the country needs to be done with people who don't have the money to pay a lawyer $1,000 or $2,000 an hour.
I know there's a lot of debate in medical fields, dental fields, et cetera, about turning some of the work over to like a physician's assistant or a dental assistant. Do you see space for, and this kind of gets back to simplifying the legal world, an expanding place for paralegals or other employees within the legal system who maybe aren't lawyers, but could help?
Yeah, increasingly the big firms have taken to using contract attorneys, who are people who don't really work full time at the firm and aren't on the partnership track and don't make as much money, but are very capable people. And then increasingly also paralegals and other kinds of legal specialists who don't have a JD can help with a lot of these issues. And it would be great to see the profession offer more support to those kinds of folks and embrace them rather than exclude them.
And what is the resistance there to, you know, bringing in or allowing, I'm thinking of a tweet I actually saw from a Vanderbilt professor where she mentioned, I know I say this a lot, but I can't get over it. How can we defend our monopoly when we help only 20% of the people who need help and we have no interest in figuring out how to help the other 80%? What is the resistance? What do the lawyers tell you when you ask them, you know, why couldn't you do X, Y, Z?
You know, I spend less time talking to big law firm partners and law firm senior managers than I did when I started out and was working for Legal Times all those years ago. But what I can tell you is that in certain circles, there is a real debate and a very fierce and bitter debate over whether a lot of lawyers have their priorities straight. There's a guy, I mentioned Civil Rights Corps earlier, Alec Karakatsanis, whom I'm sure you know, and he wrote just an absolutely blistering book. I think it was published earlier this year, late last year, called Unusual Cruelty. And it's basically an indictment of the legal profession for having all of the wrong incentives and motivations and not putting its money where its mouth is. And I'm not sure the people on this Zoom would agree with every point he makes, but after reading it, I thought a little bit differently about some of the coverage that I've done over the years. And it's good for all of us to have a little critique. I know in Washington, we reporters have been the subject of a years-long critique. It's not always a bad thing.
This is not an access to justice question per se. It's more of a inside Washington, D.C. baseball a little bit. It comes from St. Louis Public Radio's former executive editor, Margie Freivogel. How deep, how real is this split between Attorney General Barr and President Trump right now?
So earlier today, a very good source of mine who's a Republican emailed me this morning and said, oh my gosh, is Barr going to get fired by Donald Trump today? Well, it's here on the East Coast, it's 8:36 p.m. It hasn't happened yet. It's been 13 hours. It could happen in any minute. I mean, I never say never with this president anymore. So it's possible. I will say that President Trump's disdain for two attorneys general now is surprising to me, in part because his first AG, Jeff Sessions, was really the most effective cabinet member at pursuing President Trump's agenda, especially with respect to immigration and tough on crime punishments. And Bill Barr has kept President Trump in the White House out of a lot of trouble. And the notion that the president is dissatisfied with Barr for not being more thorough in announcing an investigation of his political opponent's son. The Justice Department is not supposed to talk about ongoing investigations that could affect the outcome of an election. I think we've been having a debate over the last 4 years about how that happened last time around. And the notion that the DOJ this time mostly followed the rules, I think is healthy and good, and I hope it stays that way.
And I think we just learned recently that there probably was an investigation ongoing while some of this was taking place. So it appears the lid stayed on fairly well.
It did, although there were little hints along the way in late October and early November.
This may have been asked during the St. Louis on the Air question as well, or St. Louis on the Air as well, but in case our listeners didn't get a chance to hear that, or viewers tonight did get a chance to hear that, where do you think the impact of the outgoing administration, what is it going to be on the Department of Justice? Is it just simply at the level of the political appointees, or has it started getting into the people who make the cogs function in the department, who are the civil service individuals?
Yeah, so you talk to people like Jack Goldsmith at Harvard, for whom I have tremendous respect. And Jack Goldsmith would make the case that, hey, the norms of the institution at the Justice Department largely held over the last 4 years. And I don't have as much confidence as he does about what's happened over the last 4 years. And the reason is that I've seen things there that I have never seen in my years in Washington. Like, we had over the summer 2 current DOJ employees testify in public at what they called a whistleblower hearing in Congress over political interference at the Justice Department. We've had 4 or 5 DOJ prosecutors from around the country write op-eds or letters to the editor decrying unusual decisions in criminal cases involving people close to the president and this DOJ leadership. We've had not just allegations of political interference in the criminal space, which is as serious as it gets, but also in antitrust cases the president expressed interest in, and potentially tax matters and other things. So one of the things I am hearing from people thinking deeply about this question now is that the next Attorney General at the Justice Department is going to have to name some people to do a sweeping assessment of all the cases that were brought that should not have been brought, And maybe more importantly, cases that should have been brought, but were not brought over the last 4 years. And you got to do the math and the statute of limitations and see if something can be done about those things now. And so I have never before heard of a DOJ transition where that needed to happen. It probably was in conversation in the Watergate era, but I was too young to know.
Not covering it at the time.
Yeah,
is this
right.
different than, I know President Bush's Department of Justice got a lot of pushback for some of his firings of US attorneys in various locations who they didn't believe they'd be loyal enough necessarily to the president. Is there a different feel to what these individuals, your sources, are telling you now? Like, is there a degree of worseness to what they're saying was going on here?
Yes, never seen anything like this before, ever, period. Not a political statement, just a fact. And the notion that you have lawyers, very conservative lawyers, who formed a group that they call Checks and Balances, including a co-founder of the Conservative Federalist Society, who served as acting attorney general in the George W. Bush years, raising questions about some of the actions of this Justice Department and this current president when it comes to cases and enforcement. I have never seen anything like this. And I covered at least three DOJ transitions in the past. So it's quite serious. The question is going to be whether some people are going to come back to DOJ that left over the last 4 years. And another question is going to be whether we've seen this kind of in a tiny way. I'm not sure it's been quantified yet. How many people who were installed into career jobs in the last few months of this administration who are going to be around in the new administration, and what's going to happen there in terms of cases and news.
We've talked a little bit about some of the stories that you have covered, some of the stories that I have covered around the access to justice issue, but we did have a question come in from the audience about what would be the role of the news media in highlighting some of the access to justice issues, and what could us as those media outlets do to be educating the public better on these issues?
I think that's enormously important, especially when it comes to evictions and child custody and potentially domestic violence issues. There are stories that can be done that are really important ones that convey a lot of information about the kinds of services and help that are available to people in need. And in my view, Rachel, these are some of the best stories that we can tell, right? I mean, the notion that a group of lawyers banded together and got homeless kids enrolled in school so they could eat lunch and dinner is an awfully good story, right? And often the challenge for people in pro bono groups and legal services type groups is this, that you or I are going to want to talk to people on the record, the moms, the dads, the kids, and these are sensitive topics, and there are reasons why these people will want to be anonymous, but the stories are heard so much more deeply and so much more personally if there's a human being who's experiencing the problem or who has received the help and can share in his or her own words, in his or her own voice, their story. That's what radio does better than I think any other medium. And so to the extent that people like us can talk the lawyers into giving us access to a family to help tell that story, that's going to be essential.
We touched on this a little bit at the beginning of the conversation. Beyond just closing the courtroom doors, how is the pandemic affecting access to justice?
Well, I think demand is, as we've mentioned, just totally bonkers right now, right? I mean, I think we focus mostly on housing and some family issues, but there's also a number of issues with respect to immigration, because those proceedings have not stopped entirely in a way that some other court matters have. And so there's questions about advice on immigration and immigration status that are very important. And there are certain kinds of questions as to benefits. I mentioned this briefly, but people have lost their jobs and their health insurance. They need insurance now more than ever. They need to know what kind of services are available to them and their kids. And those kinds of things are serious. As paying out of pocket for like a COBRA after you've lost your job or separated from your employer is just prohibitively expensive for a huge proportion of the country. And so those challenges are real, and I'm afraid to say that they may be getting worse in the new year until they get better.
Are you hearing of any maybe challenges coming from legal groups to try and get courtroom doors open a little bit on Sixth Amendment grounds? I know there's been a lot of judges that just said, this will not count towards your Sixth Amendment because it's an emergency, but are you hearing anything in the, whispers that there may be a serious effort to challenge that on a legal constitutional basis?
I think this cuts both ways. I did see something from the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, a group I admire greatly, that was raising real concerns about this. And I think at the local level, some public defenders' offices, some of the stronger ones around the country, have raised real concerns about this. But the other thing that I would factor in here is that, let's say you're a public defender and you're a single parent with kids, you may not want to go into court now if you're in a locality where people are not being safe and not wearing masks. And the notion that you could expose yourself and your family members by going into court is a real fear. And so I think we need to listen to people in that boat as well. I've had really, I read a quote from a single mom who's a public defender, not in a, East Coast, New York, DC place, and who was expressing real concern about how, maybe people in that court were not being super careful and not distancing and not mask wearing and not washing their hands and all the things that Dr. Fauci tells us we got to do.
As you look forward into 2021, what are going to be some of the access to justice areas you're going to be keeping an eye on? I know we mentioned the housing. Are there any other areas that you're hoping you might be able to dig into that you'll have time to do, that the DOJ beat will settle down and you can look at some other things?
Fair chance. My experience in covering transitions is that the first 6 months are just insane. So, I do have a story list, but I don't expect to get to it in a speedy way. Right now, where my head is at is the following. I find it very, very concerning, the spread of COVID-19 in prisons. I don't know if you saw today or yesterday, the Marshall Project and the Associated Press put out some new data on infection rates in these places, and they are scary. And I've been talking to people who are incarcerated, and a guy I've been talking to on and off for a few weeks told me the other day he lost his sense of smell and taste. And he hasn't called me in a few days, and he hasn't emailed me, and I'm worried about these people. I'm very, very worried about these people. And the other thing that I'm starting to think about again is that, we've got a lot of groups, including some of the most respected criminologists in the country, people like Bruce Western at Columbia, who are saying, you got to move people who are not dangerous out of prison so they don't get sick. And you've got the president-elect and the vice president-elect talking about being smarter on crime. And that means, I think, doing what some groups have called the second look process. I don't know if your DA is doing that or not, but some DAs, some of the newer DAs, are creating these second look units to maybe look at people who have been incarcerated for 30 or 40 years and think about whether they still need to be jailed or imprisoned. And so those are things I'm eager to cover in the new year amidst all the, DC grind that will happen. Some of it will be very important and some of it will be DC grind.
And if 2020 has taught us anything, that story list will probably get pushed into 2022. Let's hope not. But
right.
we think about that. If you, were to design a legal system where people could have, you know, the access to the justice that they deserved. It give you carte blanche to just kind of recreate it. What would you do with it? How would you ensure access to justice for civil, criminal victims, their families, etc., where we aren't having the conversation about 10 lawyers for 10,000 people, overworked, underpaid public defenders, etc.?
So that's a question that's way above my pay grade. What I would say is this, that most of the reasons that a lot of these people wind up needing legal help in the first place comes down to persistent inequality of income and taxation practices and disparate access to healthcare and other services. And so, as with everything else in this world, people who wind up in need of the justice system or in the justice system, either for criminal reasons or civil ones, there's something else going on. And it's not always, but often it's an issue of impoverishment and a lack of housing and food and healthcare and all of those things. And so, those are problems the country has to figure out how it wants to solve. They're big, big, big problems.
Reminder, if you have any last questions for Carrie Johnson, you can put them into the Twitch chat. Carrie, I'm wondering, obviously Ferguson was a big consent decree pattern practice investigation. Do you expect to see more movement, or what movement do you think will happen in that area with a new administration?
Yeah, so on his way out the door, President Trump's first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, signs a memo that made it almost impossible for lawyers at the Justice Department to get consent decrees, court enforceable agreements, not just on policing or those kinds of issues, but across the board. And so almost everybody I've been speaking with over the last few weeks thinks that President-elect Biden will revoke his new AG, whomever that will be, will revoke that kind of memo on day one or week one of his or her tenure at justice. The harder thing is to get some of those investigations rolling again. They take, as you know, a long time and a lot of resources. And so it's going to involve making sure people feel comfortable in the environment after a rough 4 years morale-wise at DOJ and the Civil Rights Division. And it's also going to involve maybe an even bigger challenge, which is that I think there in some places around the country, there's a feeling of, okay, it's a piece of paper, but like I really need to trust the Justice Department again. I need to trust lawyers again. I have a real, decades long, maybe centuries long mistrust of police. Mm-hmm. These are huge issues, and they're going to require a lot of sitting down together and talking. And that's not going to happen right away.
You mentioned policing consent decrees are the ones that we know mostly in St. Louis with Ferguson and others. Are there other consent decree areas that we don't even really think about that had fallen by the wayside when those pattern and practice mechanisms were sort of pulled back?
Yeah, there have been, I think, in the antitrust area and some other areas I'm less familiar with, some of those kinds of operations at Justice. Other things in the civil side with respect to companies that are not doing the right thing, engaging in civilly fraudulent activity and the like. But I think certainly for the public imagination, those ones involving policing are the most front of mind, in part because what we've been experiencing this year, and in part because, as John Smith told me, he ran that unit at DOJ in the Obama years. There were 25 of those in the Obama years, and there's been one in the Trump years.
What department was the one?
There's a one in Massachusetts and a very small force there, very small.
From your perspective as a reporter who has covered now, you said 3 transitions. So will Biden be your 4th Justice Department then, if I'm doing the math correctly on that? Or
yeah, that's right.
Yeah. How do you think covering a Biden Justice Department might be different than a Trump Justice Department? Obviously, how we do our jobs is always going to be the same regardless, but just mechanisms, talking to people, access, how is that going to feel different, do you think?
You know, I have been a reporter who spends a lot of time showing up places. And I came back from Massachusetts in late May of this year and have been working from my dining room table mostly ever since. And so it has been painful because I love doing stories about people in their lives, and I'm doing a lot of phone work, and I'm not doing a lot of traveling. And I imagine that until we get a huge percent of the population vaccinated, I'm not going to be going to the Justice Department until probably the summer of 2021 at the earliest. And so that's going to be hard. It's going to be a hard way to figure out what's going on. It's going to be a hard way to do watchdog reporting, because I intend to do a lot of watchdog reporting. A lot of promises have been made, and I want to see that. I want to see what happens with respect to those promises. I think, you know, for a while, there's going to have to be a lot of transparency at the new Justice Department, because there's been a lot of mistrust. I know famously, the Obama Justice Department treated reporters in very poor ways, actually, when it comes to trying to get access to their sources and issue subpoenas for records and even testimony in some cases. The Trump Justice Department has mostly frozen out reporters for the most part, but I think that this new DOJ team is going to have to explain the reasons why it's doing things in order to instill a sense of public confidence.
Are there changes that you have seen the Trump administration make that will be the most difficult for a Biden Department of Justice to overturn? You mentioned putting some of their loyalists into career civil service positions. Anyone who's worked with universities knows how tough that can be to move that out. What are some of the other ways that the current president has sort of set landmines for his predecessor at DOJ?
You know what, I think that's the project of the next 2 months. The transition started quite late. I have not heard complaints so far on the record about access to materials at the DOJ transition level. But I think one of the things that former DOJ people are telling me is they don't know what they don't know. And so there has to be this sweeping assessment of what actually happened, what kind of documents are in these vaults, to find out what's going on. Always, every administration, you got to go around and make a list of all the cases where there are deadlines and try to decide, are we going to totally reverse our position in this case? For instance, there's this case in New York involving a woman named Jean Carroll, who has made claims against President Trump. And the Justice Department decided to weigh in and on behalf of President Trump, which seems very unusual. I'm not sure that the Biden Justice Department will want to maintain that position in that case. The Trump DOJ,
not, but
the Trump DOJ Civil Rights Division has sued Harvard and Yale with respect to affirmative action. I'm not sure that the Biden administration DOJ will want to maintain those positions. There are a number of cases. There are ongoing lawsuits against John Bolton, Stephanie Winston Wolkoff, Omarosa Manigault Galt, all kind of people who worked with Trump or Melania Trump, who wrote books that the Justice Department is now suing them. And I don't know whether the Biden Justice Department will want to keep those cases alive. Maybe with respect to John Bolton, I'm not sure the others.
Well, Carrie, we want to be respectful of your time since you are on the East Coast, and we want to be respectful of everyone else's time leading into the weekend. Thank you, everyone, for joining us at this virtual Justice Speaks event. The recording of this event will be available on St. Louis Public Radio's Twitch channel. If you missed a question, had to step away for a second, or just want to share it again. Carrie, we're grateful that you took some time on a Friday evening to contribute to this important conversation. And of course, none of this would have been possible without the generous support of our sponsors. Again, that's Missouri Lawyers Media and the Brian Cave Leighton Paisner Law Firm. For all of us here, thank you guys so much. And we hope to see you all in person next year for our annual Justice Speaks event. So long, have a good evening.